Because as Org says, the core center of the argument that drove me away from libertarianism was a proof that the distinction between positive and negative liberty is an untenable distinction. I think it might be a gradient, but it's a pretty strong gradient. There may be some ambiguous cases, but it may in those cases be, and this is something I often find in many areas, that when you find something is confounding, you've actually conflated two things into one. It may be that something that you thought was a point of gradation between the two is actually two separate things that have been combined into one.
The conflation between positive and negative liberty, and I think I know exactly what he's talking about there. The conflation, because it is easy to conflate the two, or at least to get confused as to where the middle ground is between positive and negative liberty. It is very easy to get those mixed up, and I'm not saying that he's wrong, but I can see why that would be confusing. I would say mull it over a little bit more and think it over a little bit more, because there definitely is a difference between positive versus negative liberties, and libertarianism as a basic philosophy, whether or not you agree with it entirely, you don't have to, does make that distinction. If you've read Mises, if you've read Murray Rothbard, I think you're going to get the distinction pretty clearly. Just go back into your libertarian, primary authors, and I think that you'll find the real distinction between positive versus negative liberties.
Yeah,
I assume the audience knows the difference between those two things.
I expect so.
Should I explicate it?
Okay. I would word it more so as liberties versus provisions. Like positive rights is a guaranteed service, which is inadvisable almost every time. I would say. Yeah, I think there are some cases where you might be able to make an argument for it, but there are really bad
most libertarians. Yes. Most libertarians are saying that the positive liberties, the guarantees, that's the issue. That what we want to avoid is a restriction on negative liberty. Negative restriction on negative rights. Excuse me, to be more precise, you do want some negative liberties also as well, in terms of if the person has, if someone has infringed upon another person's rights, then negative liberty is the recompense for that.
Negative rights are a very good idea.
Away. Yes, I agree.
For example,
positive liberty.
The state cannot enforce against the use of free expression. That would be a negative liberty, and a very good one too. Obviously, definitions of what that means, but sometimes that's left up to interpretation. Sometimes that's okay. That would be a negative right, is you cannot prevent people from doing this, which is, it doesn't require any services to be provided to the public. It doesn't require any taxation. It requires an institution to determine when that is broken and when it isn't, like a Supreme Court in the US.
Well, inherently,
that's all it does.
Free speech should be a positive liberty. That's what you're allowed to do. But the negative liberty would be to remove something.
Yeah, that implies that it's positive from the perspective of the state. So if it was positive, if free speech was a positive right, it would imply that the government is providing it to you. But it's not. It is a default assumption, and so the negative right is just they can't remove it from you. It is something that humans can do anyway, and a state could restrict it.
I'm now seeing, even just in this conversation, why that could be, why you could get easily conflicted and confused about positive versus negative liberties and what they mean. Meaning it's defined by the state. It shouldn't be defined by the state. Well, this is where I'm going to get different. Because I think that the right to free speech, your right to life, liberty, and pursuit is given by God, not by the state. That's where I think I differentiate. I think the state's involved at all. Unfortunately, the state is, because we live in a human society. Well, but I think that's external even to any state.
Yeah. Aidan, you and I can certainly agree to the extent necessary for this discussion on where those rights come from. You would say from God, I would say from nature or something similar. Either way, there's something that you can do without the state making it available to you. Something like the NHS is a positive right in this country. I'm not endorsing it, but that is something that you can't just have the NHS without the state providing it. Specifically, you can have healthcare. Obviously, I'm not saying you can't have healthcare, but the NHS is a positive thing. It's something positively provided by the state to you. It's not something natural that you already have. Free speech is something restricted by the state. So preventing the state from restricting things is what negative rights are for. Positive rights, I'm not saying they're always wrong, but you should use them very sparingly.
Yes, and I think that's actually you bring up a really good point there, is that what's provided by the state versus what is natural rights. is that maybe that is the problem with the positive versus negative rights allegory or definition, is that there's natural rights which are sort of outside of that, maybe fall into a sort of third category that I'm not sure how it works.
Are ultimately positive, but not from the state.
They're positive.
The reason that they're positive in that in the universe or by physics, you're provided the right and the ability. It's not really a right. It doesn't really make sense to word it that way. But from the perspective of the rights, the positive and negative, it's written from the perspective of the state. The state is not allowed to infringe on your free speech. It's not allowed to infringe on your ability to go and find a gun somewhere, because that is a negative right as well. That's something that you can do anyway. You don't need the state to make guns. You can go get it from someone else. The state cannot infringe on your right to privacy, because initially you have privacy until someone invades it. That one may be slightly more arguable, but I think it's fair enough.
Yeah. I have to think about. You know what? I have to actually think about this for a while now.
I will not say.
I will not say that it's. And think about this for a minute.
I won't say that there is a clear, bright line between the two, between negative and positive rights. I'm sure that there is some gradation there, but not much. It is fairly clear.
We're pretty clear on negative rights, though. I think those are pretty clear. You can't kill somebody, right? You know, that's not all right. You can't do that.
That isn't a negative right. That would be a law. That a negative right would be the state cannot. A positive right would be the state must provide. Those are the distinctions. Laws, like you can't kill someone. That's
you
something
put it
different.
better than I did. Yeah. Sure. You put it way better than I did.
Not everything.
Which is funny because I'm a fucking libertarian.
Well, I mean, I have a lot of libertarian ideas too. Not everything that people can do by default should be defended as a right, like killing people. Partly because it infringes upon other people's rights, assuming a right to life. But again, that's not a positive right to life. The state should not provide you with life. It's up to you. If you try and kill yourself, it's not the state's responsibility to stop you. Although, actually, maybe there's some argument for that. But
even as a Christian, I believe you should be allowed to kill yourself if you want to. You want to kill yourself, you should be allowed to. But it's your body. It's your corpus.
Yeah,
you can do
the
it.
The state cannot prevent you from cannot relinquish your right to live. I think is fair. And maybe that's an argument against capital punishment. If you have because I am against capital punishment, but if you have a nation where murder is illegal, then capital punishment should also be disallowed, because the state doesn't get the right to arbitrarily override that right more than anyone else does. That's one argument for it.
That's why there's one of many reasons why I'm against capital punishment. I'm also against capital punishment because what if you're wrong? What if the jury is wrong? If the politic has killed one innocent person, then every single person involved in the politic is guilty of murder, by extension, moralistically. And I can't get on board with that. That's why I'm against capital punishment. Now, I also, you're not going to like my answer to this, is what do you do with, just have the government prop up people in jail for forever? No, I think they should work. I know that people don't like that answer. I think that if you're in jail, you should have to work to pay for your room and board. Which is, I know, slavery, but you're a fucking criminal. However, I'm also a little sussy on that one too.
I'm not as against that as you might think. Zorg says the classic case.
People react very negatively to that a lot.
Some people will, and I understand why. I'd be very cautious with that. The classic case study of plus or minus liberty is that liberty is freedom from, where plus liberty or positive liberty is freedom to. I wouldn't word it that way, but that may be where the confusion is coming from. Actually,
I think what he just said there is that's the truncated, cut down, most basic definition of positive versus negative liberty is. However, it is more complicated than that, and that's kind of the problem we always run into.
I personally find it more useful to word it as restrictions on the state's power as instead of negative rights versus guaranteed provisions by the state as positive rights.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I'd say that's probably a good definition. Yeah.
And again, some gradient there, but it is fairly clear. Most examples you're going to find are clearly one or the other.
Yeah.
He then says, my libertarianism was 100% about negative liberties and against positive liberties. Another distinction was your right to swing your arm stops at my nose. I think it's a perfectly defensible position in principle to just be a libertarian in favor of negative and never in favor of positive liberties. I don't think it works in practice. I think you've got to do a bit more than that in practice, but it's a great starting point for an ideology.
As I said before we started the stream too, I think I said it here, is that the problem is that you need to have some kind of overarching structure for any kind of libertarian system to work, because it can't work in a vacuum. And that's where libertarianism always runs into all of its problems, because these are great ideas, these are great theories, but in order for it to exist, there needs to be some kind of overarching structure that allows it to exist, because otherwise fascism, totalitarianism, communism, something else will come in, some form of corrupting system will come in to destroy it. It can't work alone. And that's sort of the problem that libertarians face. I'm still a libertarian, but I became a libertarian monarchist because it was like, what's the best way to preserve and protect a libertarian society? And that was the solution I came up with. I've been saying Eric von Kunau let in for 2 years. His name is Leadin. I have now learned pronounced that way because Spoon showed me a rare lecture of his, because he died a long ass time ago. He died in like the 70s, but still. So yeah, and he was a libertarian monarchist, and his work was all the work that inspired my position. Well, but again, like I didn't come to this. Going back to something we were saying earlier, I didn't like come to this yesterday. I didn't just come to like this political decision like overnight. No, it was like decades of thinking about this shit. I don't know. Anywho, sorry, we got way off track on that.
We did a bit. One last thing on this then. Achilles says, the whole distinction is just wordplay. Every negative right requires a positive right in order to either enforce it or redress grievances about its violation. That is technically true.
Yeah.
The positive right of a justice system, of prisons, of even the judges that determine whether a right is being violated or not. Technically, those can be worded as positive rights. It's not the way the term is used in practice. Technically, you could argue it is, but the fundamental structure of a nation is not what we use the term positive and negative rights for. That is a separate thing. And you could argue, well, then isn't the NHS part of the fundamental structure? That is kind of up for debate. That is an argument to be made. So it's not technically you're right, but it doesn't knock down the value of the discussion. Because there are some positive rights that aren't necessary to guarantee the negative rights, and those are a clearly different class. Although, again, there's some gradation there. Usually it's clearly different.